He's 5'2" and he's 6'4". He fights with missiles and with spears. He's all of 31 and he's only 17. He's been a soldier for 1,000 years. He's a Catholic.
This reporter, Sam Melton, White Eagle, I'm back with you. We have another Just Say No's news update.
The millions of people who've turned out in cities across Iran and Iraq demonstrate the resilience and strong base of support that the Islamic Republic of Iran enjoys. To discuss these developments and what they tell us about the changing balance in the region and globally, we're joined again by Helena Cobban. It's always a pleasure to have her with us. She is an analyst with decades of experience covering the region, and Helena Cobban directs Just World Educational and writes the newsletter Globalities. And I'll mention that Helena is co-author with Rami Khouri of the important book Understanding Hamas and Why It Matters. Helena, welcome back to the Electronic Intifada live stream.
It's great to be with you, Ali and Nora and the whole team there. I can hardly believe it's like day 1007. You guys have been amazing for these 1006 days.
Thank you so much, Helena. So good to see you.
Thank you, Helena. So let's start with the Strait of Hormuz and the broader Gulf region. What has been happening there in recent days? And do you see this as central to the fate of the Memorandum of Understanding? Trump suggested in recent days that the deal was over. And of course, we've seen this escalation of violence. Is this a return to full-scale war? Is that imminent? What do you think is going on?
So it's not just that Trump has suggested that the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed, he signed it in the Palace of Versailles on June 18th in 2 languages, in English and Farsi. So, you know, there could be no misunderstanding in terms of interpretation as to what it said. He signed it. It is an international agreement. And yesterday at the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey, he said he's tearing it up. He said it's ended. He called the government of Iran scum and other terrible words. So, you know, he's not just suggesting that he wants to end it. He is trying to shred it in a way much more blatant than what he has done in Lebanon, which we can discuss a little bit later, because obviously he's done a lot to shred it in Lebanon as well. So I just want to, if Tamara could bring up paragraph 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding, I think that would be helpful for people to see that. So this is what Trump signed. Upon signing of this MOU, the Islamic Republic of Iran will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels with no charge for 60 days only from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman and vice versa. So that is what Trump agreed to, that, you know, the Islamic Republic of Iran would make the arrangements. There's no mention there of CENTCOM or anybody else making arrangements. There is a provision lower down there that the Islamic Republic of Iran will conduct dialogue with the Sultanate of Oman to define the future administration and maritime services in the Strait, in discussion with other Persian Gulf littoral states, blah, blah, blah. So Tamara, if you could bring up map 2, that would be great. And then people can maybe understand a little bit about what's going on. I'm sure, like, no, not 2A. Yeah, that one. So as you can see here, there are the traditional pre-conflict routes to go around the Strait of Hormuz, which are white there. And then there are the Iranian routes that they have opened as of the 26th of June, which are a little bit to the north. And then down at the bottom, there is the route that Trump and his people persuaded a number of shipping, I think they were 2 tankers maybe from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which obviously are off to the west there, and an LNG vessel from Qatar. The Americans persuaded those ships to try the southern route and got, I guess they kind of twisted the arms of the Omanis to allow that to happen. And of course, what's going on here, maybe tomorrow we could get into map 1. So yeah, the Strait of Hormuz, all of it is territorial waters. There's no international water here. Half of it, roughly speaking, belongs to Oman, which has that little bit at the tip beneath the Strait of Hormuz, and half of it belongs to Iran, which, if you think about trying to drive a very large, very heavy tanker or LNG vessel or container ship around these very tight curves, you do not go fast. You have to go, maybe 5-10 miles an hour, or as they say in shipping, knots, which is kind of equivalent to a mile an hour. So you go slowly, and you have to go along the agreed shipping lanes because there are other big ships there and you don't want to crash into them. So on June 18th, that's what Trump agreed, that Iran gets to administer this for 60 days, during which they will have conversations with Oman and the other Gulf states over the lasting arrangements for shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. That is what Trump agreed, signed in 2 languages in the Palace of Versailles on June 18th. And that is what he tore up on Tuesday when he and his military people strong-armed, I want to say, persuaded maybe, the Omanis, the Saudis, the Bahrainis, and the Emiratis to use a different route. And so, to nobody's surprise, the Iranians were pretty angry, especially this was taking place, right in the heart of their funeral observances for the late supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was murdered. Of course, people here will know this, murdered along with many of his family members and about 120 senior officials of the Islamic Republic of Iran on that opening day, February 28th, of this US-Israeli aggression. So, the whole of Iran and many of its neighbors have been involved, I want to say since Saturday, in planning and then carrying out these mass observances. And we'll get to talk about that a little bit later. And as everybody should know, the final step of this is today in Mashhad, in the east of Iran, where Ayatollah Khamenei is being buried. So clearly, Trump and let's say the hawks in his cabinet planned to interrupt this, very solemn observance by, this is just some of it. This is probably, this is from Iran earlier this week, quite possibly from Qom, which is a holy city. They started out in Tehran with, I saw accounts that were more than 10 million people in Tehran coming to this. And then they went to Qom, which is a holy city a little bit to the south. And then yesterday they went to Najaf and Karbala, which are very holy Shiite cities. I think maybe this is from Najaf or Karbala. very holy Shiite cities in the south of Iraq, and we can come later and talk about what all of that means. But
Helena, before we do want to talk more about these extraordinary scenes from the funeral processions across Iran and Iraq, but to go back to what you've described, what's the motive? It's clear the U.S., Trump and the U.S. are violating the MOU. The language is very clear that Iran is to organize shipping, at least through this interim period. And then beyond that, it's to be organized by Iran and its neighbors. The US is not mentioned at all. The French Navy, the British Navy, the US Navy are not in there at all. And also, it's very clear that from the language you showed us in the MOU, that it refers to commercial shipping. So we're talking about commercial ships, not warships, and certainly not American warships passing through the strait. When he signed the MOU, Trump was very candid, in fact, more than people would normally expect of an American leader. And he said we had 4 weeks of oil reserves left, basically. That situation still continues to deteriorate. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve is depleted by more than 50% from where it was before the war, and by some measures even more than that, because you can't actually take it down to zero for technical reasons. What's the goal? What are they trying to do? Have the reasons changed for why they're still in the same bind in terms of energy? Why do they think? What's their game? Why do they want to blow this deal up?
Well, gosh, I mean, a lot of people here in Washington, D.C. do spend a lot of time trying to worry, like, what is Trump thinking of? Honestly, I think that's a waste of time, because trying to figure out what happens in that morass of neurons up at the top of his skull is a waste of time. I think clearly somebody persuaded him that, the Iranian authorities are all going to be very busy with the funeral, so let's just poke them a little bit, or test the shipping situation in Hormuz. And, I think that was a test on Tuesday, when they tried to send the few tankers and LNG carrier through, and the Iranians immediately responded. They were not asleep. They were not all busy with the funeral observances. So they got right back. And first of all, I mean, they have not admitted that it was they who sent drones against these ships. And the ships, as far as I can understand, there have been no casualties, but the ships turned around and went back. There was some physical damage to the bridges of these ships. And since then, only one ship has been seen by the satellites going along the Omani route. But the Iranians did not just, this was all on Tuesday. The Iranians hit at the ships. And then the Americans, clearly CENTCOM people, felt we've got to respond to that. So they responded. And then the Iranians responded. So on Tuesday night and yesterday night, Wednesday night, there were very substantial exchanges of fire between the American and Iranian militaries, including, most recently, we had these ballistic missiles fired against the American base in Jordan, which is interesting because, as you know, Jordan is very close to Israel. And if they can get ballistic missiles, there is a sort of a guessing game, like how deep are the Iranian reserves of these missiles, and how intact are their delivery systems. I think, obviously, the Israelis and the Americans were both very, very surprised after the assault of February 28th at the survival of not just the political echelon in Iran, but also the various wings of the military echelon. And the fact that they had this survivability doctrine that they call mosaic system of delegating to people in various commanders in various parts of the country how you should respond. And if your local commander gets killed, this is the designated person who takes his place. And if that person is killed, this is the designated third person. I mean, they had really, over the decades, built up this very resilient and, from an organizational point of view, you could say it's redundant, but it's planned redundancy, because if your commander gets killed, this is the guy who steps into his shoes. And this is, if the central commander is killed, these are the regional commanders who will make the decisions, and this is the basis on which they'll do it. So the Iranians have stunned, I want to say, they stunned the Israelis with their ability to be both politically and militarily resilient. I wrote about this maybe a couple of months ago, on my Substack, which is where I'm doing most of my writing now, by the way, not on globalities, but on helenacobban.substack.com. I think everybody's moving to Substack these days, or whatever.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and nobody in the Pentagon knows how much the Iranians have in reserve, but it's obviously from February 28th onwards, considerably more capabilities in Iran than what the Israelis and Americans thought. So that's one part of the equation. And the other is obviously the economic and also military effects for the US military, because we know that when they went to the initial MOU, well, there was the ceasefire in early April, after, I want to say, about, 6 weeks of very active fighting. And then they went to the early ceasefire, and then they codified that June 17th, 18th in the MOU, which was signed in Islamabad. So the Americans did that, as you noted, because the petroleum reserves were going down. Global prices of everything were starting to go up. And of course, prices in this country, given that there are going to be midterm elections, they're coming fairly soon now. It's going to be in early November. US financial markets were very happy when the MOU was signed and have started to get jitters now. So that's another thing that could happen, a real, financial crisis of some scale. And of course, the supplies of US and allied interceptors for anti-missile and anti-drone warfare, very, very low, which is why he couldn't give nearly enough to the Ukrainians, and said, well, you guys go and make your own. That happened at the NATO summit yesterday. Of course, the Ukrainians, it would take them about 2 or 3 years to be able to get those production lines up and running. But I think that's a major constraint for military planners in this country at a global level. There are not enough interceptors and all the things that organize the interception process, those radomes and radars and sensors and whatever, to really do what they want to do, what they want to plan to do. For example, to fend the Chinese off from Taiwan. So I'm mystified as to why Trump is doing what he's doing, but I think maybe the Israelis got to talk to him yet again, as they had back in February. Remember in February they said it's going to be a cakewalk, in Iran. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this also is just kind of this historic belligerence of the U.S. empire. They can sign agreements that they know they're going to break and they're not going to, actually adhere to. And they can kind of do what they want. And Trump being, a salesman, a con man, kind of, with this bravado. it could be that he just, yeah, I'll say, oh, I'm at this palace in Versailles. It's so beautiful. And there's, so many gilded, ceilings or whatever. And what a great place to sign this deal that I know I don't have to adhere to because I'm the president of the empire. And a real, again, historic misunderstanding of Iranian resilience and strategic planning on their part. Plus the geographical, the land, the topographical, power that Iran has in that area of its own country and in its own waters. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned resilience, Iran's internal resilience and its regional reach as we look at what it's, what it's able to do in terms of exact a price on the U.S. and Israel on these military bases around the region, but also in terms of the huge funeral observances for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, across Iran and Iraq. What does this say about this regional power in West Asia?
Yeah, well, part of the background of this, of course, is that after the January riots inside Iran, the Israelis and others told Trump that this can be a cakewalk, that if you just sort of dent the regime in Tehran a little bit, then the people will rise up. And a lot of that was reflected in Trump's very early rhetoric at the beginning of the war. He said things like, now it's up to the people of Iran and whatever. And now he has the answer from the people of Iran.
And the son of the Shah announced that he'd set up an interim government.
Right, I forgot that detail. God. Did he announce
Incredible.
it in Israel? I can't remember, but
no, he wasn't. He announced it on Twitter, like everything else these days.
Yeah, so this was really, these funeral observances were the answer from the Islamic Republic. And I've heard so many accounts and read so many accounts of people who had, back in January, perhaps been a little bit, maybe they participated in some of those anti-government protests. But then the moment the US-Israeli assault happened, people just started to rally around their national government for reasons that were probably a huge mix of reasons, religious, ideological, nationalist. It's very familiar to me because I grew up in England in the 1950s. And, my parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles were all in London under the Nazi blitzkrieg. You rally around your government when you're being bombed by obnoxious outsiders. So I think, these funeral observances have sought to kind of consolidate that feeling of rallying around the flag. And from the clips that I've seen of some of the, I wish I spoke Farsi, but I don't. But from what I gather, a lot of the chants are extremely hardline, seeking vengeance, saying things like, they killed our leader, we will come and kill you, which is quite understandable. Again, just thinking back to my family under the Blitz, and a lot of red flags, which I gather is a kind of a hardline flag. I know there's a very active kind of internal politics in Iran, which people in this country tend to completely ignore, and they think somehow the government keeps in power only through repression, which is not the case at all. There's very vibrant discussion inside Iran. And actually, if people want to, if you haven't watched this great conversation, the hour-long conversation that Max Blumenthal had with Professor Morandi as they drove to the funeral in Tehran on, I think, Monday or whenever it was they drove. And so they're sitting in the car, and Max, of course, asks very smart questions, but Morandi is just talking and reflecting on the politics, and reflecting some on his understanding of Khamenei's deep intellectual engagement with so many things that you wouldn't expect an Ayatollah to be engaged with, you know, Western literature, Time magazine, all kinds of stuff that he was, you know, he would follow very closely. So these funeral observances, and I don't know, Tamara, maybe you could bring up map 2A now, because they do kind of show, okay, that's Iran and Iraq. And so Najaf and Karbala, which is where the funeral went yesterday, are in Iraq, a little bit south of Baghdad. And then up at the north of Iran is Tehran. Obviously, that's where they started on Monday. And then they went to Qom, a little bit south of Tehran. And at some point overnight, they went from Najaf and Karbala, which are two, I've been to both Najaf and Karbala. I think I wasn't supposed to go, you know, not being a Shiite believer, not being a Muslim, but I put on an abaya, and my Lebanese Arabic was pretty damn good back then. So I passed as a Lebanese pilgrim. But so yesterday they went from Najaf and Karbala over to Mashhad in the east, northeast of Iran. And everywhere they went, there were, you know, hundreds of thousands and millions of pilgrims coming to mourn their slain leader. One of the outrageous things that Trump and his military did today was they bombed the railroad that leads to Mashhad, so that a lot of the people who wanted to travel there by rail could not. And the other thing they did last night was they bombed a bridge that's, if you see where the Caspian Sea is, and look at the bottom right-hand corner of the Caspian Sea.
The Caspian Sea is right at the top of the map, and that's just for some of us who are geographically challenged. And of course, the Caspian Sea is I think, enclosed. It's basically a giant lake, but on the north shore, which I think is just off the map, is Russia.
Right. Thank you, Ali. It's actually quite a long sea from north to south. So down at that bottom right corner, there was a very important bridge on the railroad that links Tehran to China. And last night, the CENTCOM bombed that bridge. So the bridge and the railroad, really interesting and important, because that railroad was opened. It goes directly from Urumqi in Western China to Tehran. Well, directly, that is, it goes through Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and a bunch of other countries. That is a real kind of one source of the Iranians' resiliency, having the ability to import sensitive goods by railroad directly. There are other railroads that come in via Pakistan, which is down there, you know, bottom right of the picture. I'm only seeing a very small version of the map here. I'm not sure how useful it is. But I guess what I want to say is that the governing authorities proved with these funeral observances a number of things. They proved that they retain the strong adherence and support of, I want to say, a majority of people in all these places, all these different parts of Iran. They proved that they have unbelievable administrative capabilities to be able to organize all this. I mean, people who were there on the streets. Ali, you're muted.
So are you sure they're not forcing all of those millions of people to come out?
Oh, silly me! I should have thought of that. Of course, they're
Yes,
forcing them. Yeah.
yes, yes.
But they also attracted huge numbers of. By the way, that was a joke from Ali, I think. They also had large numbers of foreign dignitaries there. So organizing all of that was huge. For example, they had somebody, I think the deputy foreign minister from Saudi Arabia, and they had the deputy speaker of the Chinese parliament, and they had people from Azerbaijan and from, I think, most Arab countries, and obviously from Turkey. And each of these dignitaries was like given a special welcome.
And a special Quranic verse, pointed Quranic verse.
Yeah, so to be able to organize all that, that does kind of prove that they have not crippled the government. Plus, it demonstrates the international support that the government retains. And this is really important. We need to recall that the MOU of June 18th was issued in the name or mediated by Pakistan, which is obviously an important neighbor of both Iran and China. And it was negotiated behind the scenes, hard to say negotiated. The Pakistanis did more than passing messages. I think they probably suggested language for how this thing could come together. It took them a long time, starting, I want to say, in late March. The Pakistanis had convened a meeting of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, three very large Muslim majority countries in West Asia, all of them very pro-American. So the Pakistanis brought them together. And remember that Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif of Pakistan was the guy who said he was going to nominate Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, he is also very pro-American at one level, but he has intriguing relationship with the Chinese that was proven. Its value was proven in May of 2025 when there was a skirmish, a very serious skirmish between the air forces of Pakistan and India. Pakistan was using mainly Chinese tech, and they absolutely wiped the floor with the Indians. So there is a sort of a Chinese dimension here in many ways. It was the Chinese back in March of 2023 who had brought about a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That is also part of what's happening here. So the regional politics are fascinating, and they prove that the Israelis have failed in their bid to become the dominant power across all of West Asia, and that is really important.
I'm just listening to you with just sort of painting these incredibly nuanced yet broad brushstrokes across the whole region in the world, that I could certainly listen to you, just let you keep talking. But let's focus it a little bit. We've gone as far east as Pakistan. Let's come back.
No. We went to China, Annie.
We did. But we're also going to come back to. I'm still thinking regionally. I'm thinking too small. You're thinking much more globally. So I have to up my game. But let's come back to, further west a little bit and focus in on Lebanon and the sort of the region of Lebanon, Palestine. Obviously, Iran had demanded as part of the MOU, and it's there in the first article of the Memorandum of Understanding, a ceasefire on all fronts, particularly Lebanon. And you have talked about, you've compared and at the same time, the US brokered this agreement later in June. So we had the US-Iran agreement earlier in June. I think it was June 12th. And then about 2 weeks later, the US brokered this agreement between the Lebanese government and Israel, which basically contradicts the MOU in certain ways, because it sort of legitimizes Israel's continued occupation of large parts of Lebanon. You've compared that agreement of June 26, 2026, with the May 17th, 1983 agreement between Israel and Lebanon, which some of us will know, but a lot of us won't know at all what that is. So give us some of the context and bring us up to date on why this comparison is relevant.
Right. Well, so the May 17th agreement of 1983 was concluded by President Amin Gemayel of Lebanon, who was acting under huge influence of the Americans, who had a large Marines force there in Lebanon. This was shortly before the bombing of the Marines barracks and things that happened to the American presence. But more importantly, May of 1983 came just a few months after the Israelis' invasion of Lebanon. So the Israelis have invaded Lebanon many times. The first time was in 1978. I was able to cover that on the ground. The second time, the biggest and most violent time, was in 1982, the big invasion that they launched in June of 1982. That was followed by the exit of the PLO fighters from Beirut, based on an American, Ronald Reagan, giving his word for the security of the Palestinian civilians left behind in refugee camps in Lebanon. And in mid-September of 1982, Ariel Sharon and Bashir Gemayel was killed. He had at that point been the president. And then Sharon, as a like way of responding to the assassination of Bashir Gemayel, which, by the way, was not done by a Palestinian, but he sent Bashir Gemayel's militiamen these very genocidal, really, I mean, I saw these people, they call themselves the Lebanese forces. They were nearly all Maronite Christians. They were deeply anti-Palestinian, and Sharon sent them into the refugee camps in Sabra and Shatila. So we had those massacres. So the Americans then said, okay, well, the Israelis need to withdraw a little bit. We will send US Marines to keep the peace. And under the influence of the US-Israeli condominium in Beirut, Bashir Gemayel's brother Amin, who had become president, was forced to sign this peace agreement. It went much further than the more recent agreement, because it was an actual peace agreement between Lebanon and Israel. And it lasted 10 months until massive popular opposition in Lebanon from all the sects, with the possible exception of the Maronites. There were some anti-peace agreement Maronites, but very few. But all the other sects in Lebanon just came together and opposed it. And so I want to say 10 months after May of 1983, that would have been like March of 1984, Amin Gemayel very, very humbly went to Damascus and said, I'm going to rescind this friends again. and President Assad said, okay, on these conditions, we can be friends again. So that one lasted 10 months. I don't know how long this one will last. It's not even a peace agreement. During that period, from May 17th, 1983 onwards, the opposition grew, obviously, amongst the Druze in Lebanon and amongst the Shiites in Lebanon, who until then had been pretty split. But the Israelis remained in all of South Lebanon, from the southern areas of Beirut on to the south. And it was that continuing Israeli occupation of South Lebanon that gave birth to Hezbollah. There was no Hezbollah before the Israeli invasion. So, you sow the wind and you reap the whirlwind, I guess.
Well, to draw that comparison out a bit, so a few months before that May 1983 agreement, the PLO, which was the major resistance force, which had been the major resistance force in Lebanon, was basically forced out of Lebanon. And this happened just so in September 1982, there was the massacres in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. And those had occurred, or they were able to happen, and they're carried out by Israeli-backed militias with the support and under the protection of the Israeli military. Thousands of Palestinian civilian refugees were murdered in the two refugee camps, and that only happened because the PLO armed forces had left Lebanon with an American guarantee that the Palestinian refugee camps and the Palestinian refugees would be safe. And that guarantee proved to be absolutely worthless, because what actually happened is these absolutely horrific massacres. And the pictures of them, which I remember seeing as a child in Time magazine and Newsweek, because that's what we had in those days, something that marked me for life. And you can say more about your experience on the ground in Lebanon. But what I want to say is they came at a moment where Israel and the United States perhaps thought they had defeated the resistance in Lebanon. Of course, there was no Hezbollah. Then Hezbollah arose as Israel entrenched its occupation in Lebanon. And I'm wondering if this agreement, too, the current agreement, is motivated by a false belief that they have also significantly weakened the resistance in Lebanon. This time, of course, not in the form of Palestinian resistance, but in the form of Hezbollah. If that's the case, and I want to hear your view on that, why do they keep miscalculating like this? Why do they keep underestimating the will of the people in Lebanon and in the region more broadly to resist and to stay on their land?
Ali. So we have to understand there are two parallel things, sets of diplomacy going on regarding Lebanon right now. We still have the provisions of the Memorandum of Understanding. That first paragraph of it, if Tamara could bring that up, it actually, says that the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran and their allies in the current war undertake from now on not to initiate any war, any military operation against each other. Final deal. Okay. They declare the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon. And then Lebanon is mentioned again. Ensuring the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon. So that is a solemn undertaking from President Trump on behalf of his government and apparently of his allies, which I guess would be Israel. Of course, the Israelis always objected to the whole of the MOU. So then Trump also has this parallel process the MOU is kind of overseen by Vice President J.D. Vance, along with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. The parallel process in the State Department here, this series of meetings between Lebanese and Israeli diplomats that reached, I think it was called a framework agreement on June 26th, run by Marco Rubio. So there's a lot of people who say this is kind of Rubio versus Vance. And they are both kind of trying to get Trump's support for them to be the next president, let's say, auditioning for the role by showing their diplomatic smarts. I don't think it's quite like that. I think Trump just loves to play people off against each other. So, Marco, you go and do this in the State Department, and JD, you go and do this in Islamabad. And, he's a kind of master of chaos. And the other part of this is that it keeps the attention on him. Gosh, what will Trump do? Which way will Trump jump? And he loves that. He loves that chaos, and he loves being, the person at the heart of it. But he did sign this international agreement that was, the first iteration of it was signed in Versailles in the presence of all the G7 people. And it was mediated by Pakistan with the support and backing of China and these other Muslim countries that I had mentioned earlier. So, if the international community as a whole wants to hold him to his word, they could and should do that. And the sooner, the better. Because all this stuff that's going on in the State Department with Marco Rubio has zero weight in, international law. I mean, it's not like an international agreement that has been signed by the head of our government here, by our president. It's some airy-fairy thing that Marco Rubio wanted to organize. But of course, that leaves it to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Egypt, and now Qatar. Qatar hosted the follow-up meeting that was, a couple of weeks ago. And so there is also something called the Pakistan-Qatar Declaration on how all this stuff, how the MOU should be implemented. And they're going to, that's when they set up a deconfliction cell for Lebanon and this and that. But I think with his actions this week of tearing up the whole of the MOU, Trump has put an end to that whole process that needs to be, if it's going to be saved, the MOU process, it needs to be saved by Pakistan, China, Saudi Arabia, and all those other actors, because the world cannot stand. I mean, the global economy, the economy of the global South, US consumers cannot stand for a wholesale return to the fighting. And I think Trump didn't figure that out. He just loves to make big gestures, but he doesn't think it through. And so it's up to the adults in the international community now to rein him in. And the MOU provided a way forward, but it's obviously needs a lot more work.
Yeah. And then, kind of circling back to Palestine, I mean, the so-called ceasefire that is now 9-10 months ago was signed. More than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed. So many children. The humanitarian aid situation that was promised under the supposed ceasefire agreement, of course, has gotten worse, not better. Israel is now taking upwards of 70% of Gaza's land, over and over and over. The violations of the ceasefire occurring on a minute-to-minute basis over the last 10 months. and then just a few days ago, Hamas recently announced, a declaration about the future of its governance role in Gaza, saying that they were essentially dissolving the administrative government. There's been so much kind of back and forth in the mainstream media about what this means. How do you look at Hamas's announcement, why they did it now, what it signifies, and really, I mean, what the strategy is behind this announcement here?
Announcement, because what they did was they announced the dissolving of something called the Emergency Committee, which is the body through which they have exercised governance over Gaza. I want to say for many years now, I can't remember exactly since when, but they have always done this within a broader framework of saying this is and should be a national Palestinian responsibility. It should be part of the PA process that they had entered in January of 2006 with huge reservations, because remember, back in the 1990s, Hamas was very opposed to the whole PA process and everything that came from Oslo. So in 2006, they entered the parliamentary elections under the PA auspices, and they won them. And that, everything goes back to that, what happened then. So since 2006, they have kind of held on to ruling over Gaza in the name of a broader Palestinian entity for a number of reasons. One is that they don't want to see Gaza cut off from the rest of the Palestinian issue. They always underline that, Gaza is part of Palestine, and we are entering into this process to try to end the occupation of 1967 on the way station to, getting full rights for everybody in the whole of Palestine. And it's a very nuanced and complex argument that they make. But so they've dissolved this. I don't know exactly why they did so, but one thing I note is that the Israelis and their the many collaborators that they have in Gaza. So the Israeli collaborators basically are on the west side of the yellow line. They're totally under Israeli military control. They've been, the Israelis and their collaborators have been systematically picking off government officials in the, let's call it the majority ruled Gaza area that's been under Hamas's control. Policemen, police officers, local government people. I mean, honestly, when I see our friend Asim Nabih trying to do what he's doing in the name of a governance authority, I just, I'm terrified for his life, honestly. He's exactly the kind of technocrat that they would be targeting. Yeah. So,
well, just to be clear, Asim was for many years working with the Gaza City municipality throughout the genocide. He has an engineering background, but for the last year or so, he has moved into being a full-time journalist with Al Arabi TV. Another category of people who is systematically targeted by Israel. But yes, you're right, Helena, of course, that the goal is to make Gaza ungovernable and to collapse any kind of system of administration or organized life in order to ultimately force people to leave.
Or to go into those terrible concentration camps, which have a long, long history in colonial governance. I just want to come back quickly to what Hamas people say they were trying to do with this latest move of dissolving the emergency committee. It seems that they were trying to open the way to welcoming into Gaza the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, which is a body created under the Board of Peace. All Palestinian technocrats under the leadership of, I think, Dr. Ali Shaf, currently located in Cairo. And the Israelis don't let the National Committee under the Board of Peace, they don't let it go to Gaza and administer Gaza. So, so if the Board of Peace had any integrity, I was about to say cojones, but no, I don't even want to think about that. If they had any integrity, they would insist that, their own committee would be able to go and administer Gaza. So I think the Hamas leaders took this step to underline it is not we who are preventing this from happening. It is the Board of Peace. I have to say, the Board of Peace exists maybe in somebody's imagination. Actually down the street from us here in Northwest DC, there was a big gala kind of opening for the Board of Peace. When was it? Back in November or December, and dignitaries from all around the world came and blah, blah, blah. They don't have any budget.
Yeah.
They're not doing anything. It's everything that's happening in Gaza is still under the uncontested control of the Israeli military. And that includes, obviously, them pushing forward the yellow line in order to constrict the Palestinian held areas even more, and, preventing the entry of the aid trucks, which, if you look back at that ceasefire agreement that Hamas did sign in early October, there was to be a complete ceasefire and the entry of 600 trucks a day. And what Hamas did not sign in that agreement was they did not agree to disarm.
And on that point, Helena, if I may, I'd like to look at the response that Dr. Ali Shaf gave regarding the statement from Hamas about its willingness to dissolve its governance committee. I think this is very important. Ali Shaf is a former deputy minister in the Ramallah-based Palestinian Authority and appointed by the so-called Board of Peace to head this National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. And he says, in a series of tweets, the first one is there, following today's announcement regarding the dissolution of the Emergency Committee in Gaza and the completion of preparations to transfer administrative responsibilities to the NCAG. And then he continues, I don't know if you're able to follow to the next tweets, Tamara, but I'll keep reading. He says, we affirm that NCAG stands fully prepared to assume its national responsibilities as soon as the necessary conditions and enabling measures for its work are in place. Then he says, this is the crucial part. The essential requirements for the committee's effective functioning include the existence of a single governing authority operating under one legal framework with a clear mandate and a unified security apparatus accountable to that authority. These prerequisites are fundamental to establishing the political, administrative, and security environment for the committee to carry out its responsibilities effectively. Now, what does that mean? The essential requirements include the existence of a single governing authority operating under one legal framework with a clear mandate and a unified security apparatus. The way I read that is Hamas has to disarm. The resistance has to disarm before the National Committee can get going. And
Thank you. Just Say No. All right. Thank you for joining me on Just Say No and the Electronic Intifada. Have a good evening. Thank you.